Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little, and I am here today to do a brief presentation on pot control for the Taking It Down radio show for the new segment called Tips from the Shark. If you guys want more information from me, definitely check out everything I have for free at jonathanlittlepoker.com. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what exactly is pot control? Whenever you have a marginal made hand, you are often in a situation where you are either way ahead or way behind whatever your opponent has. So the act of pot control is usually checking behind on the flop or the turn in order to avoid getting blown off your hand when your opponent check raises you, to induce your opponent to bluff on the river if he happens to have garbage or worse made hand, or to extract value from worse made hands on the river. So as a really quick example, suppose you raise with ace 10 offsuit from middle position and the player in the big blind calls. And you know this guy is a relatively splashy, loose, aggressive player. Say the flop comes ace jack 3. That's a pretty good spot to continuation bet when your opponent checks you. So let's assume your opponent checks, you continuation bet, and he calls. Let's say the turn is a queen. So ace jack 4 queen. Let's just assume it's something like that. It really could be any board with an ace and a bunch of other cards that does not give you two pair. If your opponent checks on the turn, this is a pretty reasonable spot to check behind, especially on boards where it's somewhat likely your opponent could have two pair. Like let's say you could have queen jack or even a better ace like ace jack or ace queen. Also boards like ace 9-8-7 are pretty good boards to check behind on, because if you bet, a lot of opponents will not call on the turn unless they have either a reasonable hand or a reasonable draw. And against reasonable hands, your top pair with a marginal kicker is not in great shape. And against reasonable draws, you are ahead, but at the same time, you don't necessarily know which outs you need to fade on the river. So this is a fantastic spot to check. Then on the river, whatever the river card is, it doesn't really matter. If your opponent bets, you should tend to call. By checking behind on the turn, you are sort of telling your opponent that you do not have a very good hand. So if your opponent thinks you don't have a very good hand and he's betting, that often means he's either betting for value with a marginal made hand, such as any ace, maybe even middle pair, or he's bluffing with absolutely nothing. Either way, you have to recognize you have induced your opponent to bluff by checking behind on the turn, so that's going to make him fairly likely to bluff the river. So that is what pot control is, and you're going to find that it is a very good play, especially against players who will check raise the turn and put you in a terrible spot. Because if you're sitting there with ace 10 on an ace jack 4 queen board and you get check raised, there's no way you can be happy at all. I actually wrote about this concept extensively in my first book, Secrets of Professional Tournament Poker Volume 1. But I've seen some of my students misapplying this topic, either always pot controlling with their marginal made hands or never pot controlling. And I definitely think that you need to pot control in specific situations. So the times you want to pot control are when you are very likely to be way ahead or way behind, such as the example I just gave you. You also really want to be pot controlling when your opponents will bluff when the turn checks through on the river. So you don't necessarily want to be pot controlling on the turn if your opponent will never bluff into you on the river. That's part of the added benefit of pot controlling the turn, is that you induce your opponent to make an error. But if you know your opponent is a tight passive player, that's a scenario where you don't necessarily want to pot control. You also want to pot control whenever you think your opponent could easily have a marginal made hand, such as on ace jack 4, maybe your opponent has jack 10. You want to pot control and that guy could have jack 10 and always fold if you bet the turn, but he'll either value bet the river, maybe bluff the river, or check call the river and pay you off. So by checking behind the turn, you get one additional street of value. And you're going to see, whenever you do get a little bit more experience pot controlling, that whenever you do check behind on the turn, you're often giving your opponent a free shot to outdraw you. And a lot of amateur players really hate giving their opponents a free shot to outdraw them. They think they have the best hand, therefore they must protect it. But you're going to find that if your opponent's drawing to only 5 outs or less, or even 8 outs, it's not that big of a deal to let them draw to them. Because whenever you do pay off your opponents, you're not paying them off for a huge bet because you pot controlled. The pot's not going to be too large. And whenever your opponents miss, they're often either going to bluff or pay you off poorly. So a lot of my students really took this to heart, and they started crushing the games using pot control. However, as they moved up to the higher stakes games, they found that blindly pot controlling every time does not necessarily lead to the largest amount of profit. So they have to learn when to not pot control. And the primary times you do not want to pot control are when your opponents will not pay you off poorly on the river. They're going to have hands like Jack 10 on the Ace, Jack 4 Queen board. The turn's going to check, and they're just going to check fold the river, even though they have the middle pair. They're going to realize that you pot controlled. And whenever your opponents will recognize that, that's a scenario where you definitely don't want to pot control. And you also do not want to pot control whenever your opponents will not bluff the river. Basically, if your opponents are not going to put money in poorly on the river when you check behind the turn, you might as well go ahead and bet the turn for value. Against these players, whenever you are betting on the turn, ideally you want to have a relatively clear idea of what you're going to do whenever you get check raised. Usually against players who will not pay you off on the river, you're going to want to fold if they check raise you on the turn. So against the most tight, passive, straightforward players, pot controlling with stuff like top pair with a reasonable kicker is not the best idea, because they will be inclined to pay you off poorly if you just go bet. And obviously, you'd rather get 3 streets of value than 2 streets of value. So against those players, you want to bet with the intention of folding on all 3 streets. So there are definitely a lot of ways that you can play top pair, but especially in tournaments where losing one significant hand can cost you your stack, you always want to play in a manner that allows you to lose multiple hands before you go broke. And this is one of the key things that professional players do that allow them to frequently succeed in tournaments. They have to lose 3 or 4 hands before going broke, whereas a lot of players who are not aware of this concept of pot control have to lose only 1 or 2 hands before going broke. As one more brief example, suppose you raise with pocket aces, right? A very good hand. And 2 or 3 players call you. Say the flop comes 9-8-4. This is a spot where when they check you, you're going to want to bet for value and protection. Say one player calls. Let's assume you're in position. Usually you're going to find that pot control is slightly better in position than out of position, but it's still fine to do out of position as well. If the turn's pretty much any card, whatever it is, it's probably wise to check behind on the turn. Even though you have pocket aces, you do not have to bet for 3 streets of value. So don't fall into the habit of thinking that just because I have a hand that looks to be pretty good that I have to value bet or I have to protect my hand. Check behind the turn, and then whenever your opponent bets the river, happily call. Also notice that you are not raising the river, because if you raise the river, your opponent's probably only going to call if he can beat an overpair. That's a topic for another day, but whenever you're making a bet, always think, can my opponent call with a lot of worse hands? And if the answer to that is no, raising or betting is usually not a great idea. So that's going to be it for today. I appreciate all of you for listening to this. If you want more from me, definitely check out jonathanlittlepoker.com.